Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to be discussing wind erosion. Now, before we can begin talking about wind erosion, we first have to kind of go over and review what erosion is. Now, erosion is the movement of particles that have been weathered or broken down. In the last video talking about water erosion, we talked about how erosion occurs through these three major processes as weathering does through water, wind, and ice. And weathering and erosion go hand in hand and they can occur simultaneously. So, as some of these particles are being weathered or broken down, they can also be moved or carried away to a new location. And erosion can be gradual, like we saw with the formation of canyons and water erosion, or it can be sudden, like with avalanches and mudslides that also occur due to sometimes water erosion. Now, how does wind erosion work? Now, wind is able to erode massive amounts of tiny particles or sediments and carry them far away. And so, when we are talking about wind moving these smaller amounts of sediments and particles, one of the most common types of wind erosion we see is with sand and sand dunes. So if we look at this picture on the left, this is a picture of sand dunes. And throughout parts of the United States and various parts of the world, we know that in desert type environments, that as the wind blows, it carries the top of these sand dunes and moves them to a new location. Now, one of the amazing things that we can see is if you go to a part of the desert and you see these sand dunes, if you come back a year, 2 years later, that sand dune that you are standing on either will look completely different. It may be larger than it was because some sand from other places are now coming on top of it, or maybe it's a little bit smaller because parts of the top that you were once standing on are now in a different location because they have been moved, or it doesn't might even exist at all because all of the sand that made that big sand dune that you may have been walking on are now no longer there because they have been moved to a new location. And so as sand begins to erode, as it begins to move to a new location, it begins to create new sand dunes. And so the way that the desert looks is always changing. And another example of wind erosion is not carrying sand, but carrying things such as dust. And so if you see on the right here, here is a picture of dust and some other kind of sediments on the top of the earth, maybe from farmland and other places that have been picked up and are being moved. Now, one thing that we kind of see through wind erosion is if you've ever kind of been in a tornado, that tornado effect sometimes with heavy winds are also able to pick up. And so when we talk about things such as sudden wind erosion, we have things just tornadoes that can pick up large amounts of sediments through winds that are very strong and high in miles per hour. Now, one of the most famous in the United States, that is, records of wind erosion is at a time of the Dust Bowl. Now, the Dust Bowl occurs in the 1930s, and during this time in this part of the United States, a big drought was occurring. And so, due to poor agricultural conditions, when there's drought, there's not as much rain. So, a drought means a long period of time without rainfall. And so, as the drought begins to go on and the rain is not falling, we see these farmers, these agricultural places not fully adapt to their environment to prevent wind erosion. Now, I am no farmer by any means, and I am no agricultural scientist, but I do know of wind erosion. And I know that when these severe droughts begin to occur, that the surface of where we would be planting these crops for our agriculture can begin to be picked up by the wind. And that's why some of these different agricultural techniques are created or used to preserve the farmland. When that didn't occur, the Dust Bowl began. And the Dust Bowl began to move massive amounts of dust and other kind of sediments and dirt that were on top of these agricultural farmlands and move them hundreds of miles, if not in the thousands. And they moved from the middle of the United States almost to the coast. And so the Dust Bowl finally ended when the drought ended, but we saw that the long-term ramifications were already done. A lot of as we see here in the picture at the bottom left, we see a lot of damages to property and to homes and to whole towns that were caused through this massive wind erosion, property damage, and everything like that. We saw some families, even if you look at the picture on the right, that homes were destroyed and they had to move. They had to move to a new place. They had to get out of the path of this huge dust bowl that was sweeping through. And so it had a lot of huge and major effects on the United States during this time. And as we've learned now to adapt better to these agricultural kind of effects when there is drought. Now, when there is a severe drought, we've learned what to do or how to better adapt. So, in summary, erosion is the movement of particles that have been weathered or broken down. The processes of weathering and erosion have similar methods through water, wind, and ice, and can occur in tandem, hand in hand, simultaneously. When we see wind erosion, we see wind carrying massive amounts of tiny particles or sediments and carrying them far away, whether it's moving sand and deserts from one place to another, or in larger, more historical contexts with things such as the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. So I hope this helps, and I can't wait to see everyone in the next video. Bye, everyone.